Hi, Year 12. This is our first lecture in the theory section for crime and deviance. And this focuses on the idea of value freedom and whether sociology can actually be free from values or whether that's even desirable. So what does it actually mean? The term value refers to attitudes, beliefs and opinions which people may hold, which might influence their behaviour and particularly the way they see the world. In the context of research, might influence how they interpret their findings, for example. Policies on divorce and cohabitation tend to emphasise the importance of family values. So recently, for example, they've introduced tax relief for married couples. Now, can you tell me what types of sociologists emphasise the need to free sociology from values and to be totally objective? So which type of sociologists favour the scientific types of research? And what types of sociologists say that this objectivity is very undesirable and, if not anything else, impossible? In the 19th century, which was the period of enlightenment with the shift away from religion towards science, sociologists like Comte and Durkheim saw the role of sociology as discovering the truth about how society works, uncovering laws that explain people's behaviour. Now, these laws, they would be objective and they would be factual and they would be deterministic. How could they achieve this? How could they uncover laws that explain people's behaviour? You might want to think about what sorts of research methods that they might be able to have used. And how do you think some of these proposals or these laws might affect society and government? So, for example, you might argue that there is a societal law between someone's social class and how well they do at school. And if you're aware of the impact of class on education, what sorts of policies might you introduce to combat it? In some ways, Marx can also be considered a positivist in the sense that he scientifically analysed historical documents on the evolution of society from a very primitive type of society to modern-day capitalism. And he argued that by looking back at the evolution of society to his day, he could predict that communism was in the future. And this method's known as historical materialism, when you look at lots of historical documents to come to a conclusion or a prediction of the future. However, many criticise him for being unscientific and using something called the inductive method. This is when you come up with a theory about society and then you find lots of evidence that supports your view. So, Marx, capitalism is evil, and he found lots of evidence to support that it was evil when there was evidence of a class struggle. What's key to remember about Comte and Durkheim and Marx is that all of them believed that science and the scientific study of society was the key to delivering the right kind of society. Comte and Durkheim both wanted to use their research for the social good of improving society. So, should sociologists be value-free in their research? Now, modern positivists would say yes, certainly. And they would take it a step further. They argued that research should be objective and uncontaminated by value judgments, which come from humans. However, they believe that, sociologists shouldn't do research necessarily for creating social good. That in itself is a value, trying to change the world because of your research. Sociologists instead should only study observable phenomena and measure the relationship between the variables, and that's it. However, can you actually see social class? Can you actually see it? Well, no, not really, but you can measure its effect. You can see the effect of not having the material resources to buy a good diet, and you can see the effect of low social class in the likelihood of committing crimes or reoffending, okay? Positivists, however, believe that quantitative methods are therefore the most suitable when trying to study society scientifically. These methods are reliable, okay? And can you remind yourself, what does it mean to be reliable? Okay, if a method's reliable, what does that mean? Like the natural sciences, okay? However, one of the key evaluation points for the positivist point of view is that are the natural sciences really neutral? Do they let any of their values influence their process of research? For example, who's sponsoring their research? Or do scientists come up with predictions about the world, and do they find evidence to support that? Are they really the objective scientists that positivists would like us to believe? And then there's also considering natural sciences like meteorology and trying to predict the weather. Now, how often do they get that wrong? And, can you actually observe the phenomena around the weather predictions? So if we think of meteorology being a natural factual science, maybe sociology isn't so far off the study of the weather, because you can't see everything and sometimes you might get it wrong. Why do you think scientific statements about the world carry more weight than non-scientific statements? Okay, arguably the authority for scientific knowledge comes from the idea that these scientists must have gone through a particular process to get to their facts, so therefore we believe them. The idea that the data collected is collected rigorously, okay, and use of experiments in laboratories with white coats, for example. That's all our idea of what a proper scientific study should be. We would expect the evidence to come from a variety of sources, and we'd argue that, we'd want the ways in which such knowledge is being tested and to try and disprove its reliability and validity. What's that process called again when you test and test and test a theory in science to see if it's true? However, can you remember any problems with the reliability of how science is tested? Okay, is it always conducted in exactly the same way? And what about the validity of science? Is science definitely telling us the truth at all times? Is there anything that might influence it? Max Weber is a social action sociologist, okay? So he sits within the symbolic interactionist camp. He is essentially an interactionist, okay? And he argued that values are central features of all societies and so are at the heart of sociological study. He argued that because sociologists are part of society, we are unable to completely detach ourselves from our values, okay, and therefore will be influenced by them. However, he believed that we should be very open about our values and we should try and not let them influence our research. Also, he said we should declare our values so that other people looking at our research can be aware and maybe test if our values have influenced the research in any way. So, what are the different ways that values can affect the research process? Well, there's a selection of the subject matter in itself. So, for example, if you're a feminist, you value gender equality, okay, and that might affect the research you do. The questions a researcher asks to the observations they choose to make might influence the findings. How researchers interpret the data and the patterns they look for can be influenced by their values. The perspective within which the researcher has chosen to work, okay, so Marxism, feminism, postmodernism. And the final one, which for some reason has been cut off your PowerPoint, was who is it that benefits from the outcome of the research? Now, what effect would this have on the research process? It's quite a difficult question to consider. Like, how can we be personally objective and at the same time aware of any value judgments intruding on the research process? It's quite challenging to be aware of your own bias. So as a result, Weber said we need to be clear about our values at the very beginning in order for other people to recognise if our bias is present. So the interpretivists disagree with the positivist point of view. They believe it's impossible and undesirable to be neutral in research. People in the subject matter of the natural science are predominantly different to things like rocks and chemicals. Rocks and chemicals react the same way every time, no matter what. However, people don't. They have consciousness, the amount of sleep they have might affect how they respond, and they think about their actions, which rocks cannot do. As a result, behaviour is not the product of external forces, according to interpretivists. They are not structural theories like Marxists and feminists, but the product of meanings and motives, okay? So the research method needs to take this into account. We need methods that are qualitative, that help us to uncover the true meaning that people give to their world around them. Can you think of any qualitative methods that might help you do this? So what would positivists and interpretivists say about the roles of values in specific research methods? Well, positivists would be highly critical about values in participant observation. They would say that participant observation is affected by the subjective, value-laden interpretations of the observations made by the researchers. Basically, they see what they want to see or expect to see. On the other hand, interpretivists would be critical of an apparently value-free method such as questionnaires, because they would argue that positivist sociologists that use questionnaires actually, because they choose the exact questions and tend to restrict the responses because they might be closed, their values have already influenced the outcome of the research, thus not painting a true picture of the social world, allowing them to uncover the truth behind the meanings that people give to it. Howard Becker, who we've come across before, grandfather of labelling theory, he says that it is impossible to study anything without using your personal and political beliefs to understand it. He also argues that sociologists have a duty to side with the underdogs in society, so those that are less powerful, possibly considered deviant, or the poor, as their views are otherwise seldom heard. These are the groups that are marginalised and are not listened to mainstream sociologists, politicians, etc. He uses the example that when conducting research of mental health care, for example, sociologists decide on the behalf of the mental health patients that have been committed because they are the least powerful group whose voice is least likely to be heard by mainstream society. Okay, so in the context of crime and deviance, we should side with the group of people possibly within prison or the criminals, the ones whose voices are not often heard. But researchers need to state very clearly whose side they're on. They should say that they're on the side of the underdogs, but this is a big dilemma. Now, Goldner takes this a step further, and I'm sorry you can't quite see the full PowerPoint here. He argues that values and humans are inseparable. Okay, you cannot detach your values from your human self. Okay, and he talks about the bull and the man in the Minotaur. Okay, and there's a helpful picture of what a Minotaur looks like. You've got the body of a man and the head of a bull. Okay, so the body is human, the head is not human, and he says that's what it's like for humans and their values. You cannot separate us. We are biologically linked. Steve Taylor takes us he's a bit critical. He recognises the role of values in research. However, he does say you cannot let your own values take over your research. Otherwise, you'll just write about your own personal experience of that research and not see what's going on around you, okay? So even if you recognise that you have your values, you must try and maintain some level of objectivity. Otherwise, your research stops being research and starts being a personal interpretation of the world around you. Now, consensus theories, what would they say about values? So think about what are our consensus theories that we know about, okay? Now, they would argue that certain values exist because they are needed by society to create social harmony and to allow the society to function in an effective way. So, the nature of men and women's roles within the family, okay, with men being the breadwinner and the women providing the emotional support, because we share that value, okay, it means that the family unit operates in an effective way that's needed by society. Also, the value of monogamy keeps the family unit stable. Conflict theories, can you think of any conflict theories? Say that values actually help to serve the interests of the most powerful in society. So Marxists, for example, would argue that the value of meritocracy supports the ruling class because it means that they can exploit the working class and pay them low wages. However, the people, because they have a false class consciousness and a belief in meritocracy, believe that the harder they work, the better they will do, which is not necessarily true. Now, what would feminists say about values? So as I said at the beginning, the core debate here is whether sociology can or should be value-free. Should or bias be removed from sociological research, and what is the benefit? These are very common 33-mark questions. Here's a quick summary of the positivist view and the interpretivist view. Weber is one of the main sort of interpretivists you might want to refer to. So you might want to annotate this onto your PowerPoint. So where do values actually influence research? Well, they influence research in a range of areas, okay? Choosing the topic is one of the big areas. Getting the funding. When you operationalize key concepts, for example, so, what influences your definition of sex discrimination or racism? And is yours going to be different to maybe someone who lives in a different part of the country or the world, okay? Choosing a research method will also influence your findings. Like, what do you value in research? If you value meaning, then you are going to pick qualitative research methods like participant observation. Okay. However, if you value discovering patterns and social laws, then you'll look for more quantitative methods like official statistics. Both methods can paint completely different pictures of exactly the same problem. Okay. If you could annotate some of these issues of influence values into your PowerPoint, and we can talk about it next lesson. One of the key issues is certainly funding in sociological research. Okay. Some of the main sources of funding are the government, universities, and some big private organisations. So if you are sponsored by Civitists, you might be aware that they are very conservative. So therefore your research might have to agree with them. So you might focus on topics such as how absent dads create deviant sons, because that's the sort of finding that Civitists would be interested in finding out about. Okay. And the key idea here is don't bite the hands that feed you. If you disprove something that the government is promoting, they may cut your funding, or they might just ignore your findings, which is exactly what happened when the Conservative government commissioned some research into the effect of military treatment in juvenile detention centres, like getting their people up for military routines, treating them like they were in the army. The sociological research for this policy proved that it had no impact on the reoffending rate. Despite this, the Conservative government carried on and rolled out the policy across all the juvenile centres in the UK. So it does tell you that actually your research, if it goes counter to what your sponsor believes, they might ignore it or they can cut your funding. Interpretivists, however, would argue that sociology can't be value-free, and we need to recognise that. Okay, sociologists are human beings studying other human beings, so therefore they interpret it in the world in completely different ways. Okay, and it can lead to misunderstandings, such as fights. Okay, or misunderstandings over words like what poverty means. To understand the world, we must explore the meanings and motivations of others using their experiences, and this is known as Verstehen. This is one of Weber's key ideas, Verstehen. Postmodernists have a different view. Okay, they actually argue that scientific explanations are no more valid or useful than any others. They say that there's a variety of truths about the world, and any explanation, scientific or otherwise, that claims to have a monopoly of the truth goes against their ideas. They're very critical of meta-narratives, whether they're religious, scientific, or otherwise. They also point out that science is potentially dangerous, and people are rapidly losing their faith in science. Lyotard, a famous postmodernist, points out that Phenomena like the nuclear weapons and cigarettes and the development of weaponry generally has led to quite a lot of people losing faith in science, and they shift to other forms of truth. Science can't really be objective. It's not going to be here forever, according to postmodernists. Therefore, sociology shouldn't and probably can't aim to be objective as well, because science isn't something to aspire to, according to postmodernists. The same issues that affect the value freedom argument affect the science debate, with positivists arguing that scientific study of society is possible and interpretivists disagreeing. Interpretivists say it's impossible for sociology to be scientific because, as I said before, people are not rocks and not chemicals and cannot be studied in the same way. Some interpretivists, however, actually question the very nature of what science means, and they're critical of the idea that science is this golden standard for research, okay? And they're critical of the role of scientist values influencing the research process itself, and they say it's unrealistic for scientists to claim that there are no subjective values in their research. Feminists and Marxists, finally, argue that science is another means of controlling the less powerful groups in society. So feminists would argue that science has been controlling women, okay, through promoting the idea that men are physically stronger than women. And Marx argues that science has been used by the ruling class to suppress the working class and to control their behaviour. Okay, I mean, the development of different technologies now is used to monitor people. I think considering Kuhn and Popper, who we have talked about before when we looked at belief systems and ideology in your beliefs unit, can you remember Kuhn's ideas about science? He talked about scientific paradigms, and he argued they shift over time. Can you remind yourself what exactly is a paradigm? Okay, according to Kuhn, what is a paradigm? So, can sociology be a science according to Kuhn? Well, no. Sociology is not unified enough under a single theory of society or paradigm. But according to Kuhn, science isn't all that great or factual. So again, we shouldn't necessarily aspire to scientific approaches because they're going to move over time. Karl Popper, however, is quite pro-science because science is open to the process of falsification. He said, science is an open belief system which changes over time when new ideas can prove old ones wrong. So, can sociology be a science? No. There are many theories and ideas which are too abstract and cannot be falsified, cannot be proven wrong. So, how can you disprove the existence of false class consciousness, for example? How can you measure that? You can't. Another view is that actually sociology is pre-science because it has so many competing views on how the world works. A little bit like when the society was going through the change from religion to science, there was a debate about which was really true. Postmodernists think this is a good thing as they reject meta-narratives as seeing them being unrealistic. One thing it's worth remembering that this debate needs to be linked back to a question on whether sociology can be scientific or not. So be careful not to drift off into an essay about the pros and cons of science. Finally, we have the realists, which sit in the middle. They argue that it is possible and desirable for sociology to be scientific because they argue that the human science of sociology is very similar to the natural science. Sayre argued that the natural world can only be studied in either open systems or closed systems. A closed system in science is when every single variable can be controlled and measured. All of the phenomena can be observed and precise predictions made. This needs to take place in places such as laboratories. However, Sayre argues there are also open systems in science where variables cannot always be measured, and we can't always see the phenomena or make completely accurate predictions. A good example of this is astronomy, okay, the study of space. Plenty of physics scientists talk about the existence of black holes, and they've made many predictions based on black holes and quantum science, for example, quantum physics. However, no one has ever seen a black hole. No one's ever been able to measure a black hole. All of it is predictions based on unobservable phenomena, a little bit like sociology. Sayer argued that both types, human and natural science, are equally scientific, as many processes in the natural sciences are not observable, for example, gravity, just like social life, for example, class, and yet they affect the physical world. You can see the effect of gravity and you can see the effect of class. So therefore, sociology is like the science of open systems. So can you quickly think of any examples of open systems and methods, and any examples of closed systems or methods? Thank you very much, Year 13.